Funding for Overheard with Evan Smith is provided in part by Hillco Partners, a Texas government affairs consultancy, Claire and Carl Stewart, and by Laura and John Beckworth, Hobby Family Foundation.
I'm Evan Smith. They're the comedians, writers, and actors who've lent their talents to one of the iconic institutions in American comedy and have gone on to become some of the biggest names in entertainment and pop culture. They're the alums of Saturday Night Live. This is Overheard.
Let's be honest. Is this about the ability to learn, or is this about the experience of not having been taught properly?
How have you avoided what has befallen other nations in Africa and
You could say that he made his own bed, but you caused him to sleep in it.
You know, you saw a problem and over time took it on. And let's start with the sizzle before we get to the steak. Are you going to run for president?
I think I just got an F from you, actually. This is over.
You got on the show in part because of Dana Carvey, right? Dana Carvey got...
Well, Dana and I, Dana and I knew each other from the stand-up
right.
Circuit, and Dana was also renting a room over the garage in this house I was renting with some other comics in the Hollywood Hills.
Yeah.
When he came down from San Francisco, he would stay there. And we, we would kind of jam in the driveway on, with different kind of character stuff. I wasn't a character impressionist or anything, I just did stand-up.
Yep.
But Dana, of course, was into all that.
Seemed like that was his big thing.
Yeah. So Dana got the show that summer of '86, and they start in the fall.
Yep.
So he goes to New York. I'm dating Jan Hooks at the time. We were friends for about 6 years, and then we started dating, which is the best way to do it. Yeah. But that didn't last. And
she was on the show at that point?
She was not on the show.
Not on the show.
I was excited for Dana and for Jan because they were up for Saturday Night Live. Dana had it already. Jan was up for it, sure to get it. And I'm reading Backstage Live, Saturday Night Live, and excited for them. Never thinking I would ever be on that show because I didn't really even have the representation to get me an audition, and I didn't do characters. I never did an improv. I wasn't brought up in the improv ranks, and so Dana calls me from New York that summer, and he goes, "Hey, I think they're still looking for one more cast member. I told them about you, and I think they might want to see your tapes."
I want to ask you about Weekend Update specifically. The show is now going through a transition, as it has a couple different times, from Seth Meyers now to Cecily Strong being the only anchor of that program. She's talked about the challenge and the pressure, having to step into those shoes, what it's like. You were 3 years in that chair. You did a great job. People remember that time very fondly. Can you talk about what it was like? Because it is really not like being just a regular cast member.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, it's added responsibility, especially if you're doing sketches as well.
Right.
Dennis did a great job up there, but he wasn't doing sketches
all he
mostly.
did.
Yeah. So
Tina Fey most of the time also was just not doing sketches.
But Tina Fey was also the head writer on the show. Yeah. It was hard to get people to write jokes for Weekend Update because it wasn't a glorifying position. People on Monday weren't talking about Weekend Update jokes so much. They were talking more about characters or whatever they saw. And so they would try to entice writers to come up to the 17th floor at 30 Rock on Saturday morning.
Yep.
Because you couldn't really write jokes before that because all the other late night talk show hosts would do the jokes already.
Yep.
They would cover that territory. So you had to really wait until like Friday night, Saturday morning. And so they would put out a breakfast buffet and newspapers and AP photos. There was no internet or Google at the time.
Right.
So AP photos and newspapers. And a lot of the writers would come up just to have breakfast and read the paper. It was a hot buffet,
Yeah.
And then some of the younger writers would come up to try to write, jokes, but they mostly weren't good. And then there was Al Franken, who was, a political junkie, and a couple other people. And then I would write, I'd get 3 or 4 jokes on a week. And then I would pay, out of my own pocket, $50 to friends on the West Coast or in New York to fax me in jokes.
Yep.
That I would pay for.
Comedy writers.
People that wanted to write. And so we would get about 20 jokes out of all that. And it was, but it was a fun job.
Yeah.
It was a fun, thing. It was a nice change for me after being on the show for five years.
It was a transformational thing to get that show, right? For everyone who's been on that show, even the people who had bad experiences on that show, will say that being on that program was transformed their careers.
I guess so. Yeah. For me, it happened bless you. For me, it happened so quickly because, I had like 3 days to get to New York. And I had friends that didn't even know I was on the show.
Right.
And, but it does change your life, just to be on that show and to be in New York.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it. I liked it. You know, a lot of people complained about the schedule and the stress, but I knew for me it was a marathon. It wasn't a sprint.
Right. It's almost a cliche at this point to have been on the show and to say, oh, it was so hours were so bad and everything was so difficult. And, you know.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I loved it. You know, I didn't stay up late like a lot of people. You know, the original cast would stay up, you know, Tuesday night all night long and write sketches for the next day, and that's because they were doing drugs back then, you know. Yeah. And when I came in on the show, nobody was doing drugs. You know, I came in with Phil Hartman and Dana Carvey and, you know, Jan Hooks and those people, and everybody was pretty responsible. And it was a different time then too. Right. So you know, it was sensible hours for me, and you know, I got to meet some of my idols that I, you know, grew up watching or listening to: Paul McCartney, Mick Jagger, James Taylor, all these people that I loved and I got to be friends with. And Steve Martin. And so I love the job. It
is a really hard job, though, because you have to write yourself into the show. It's not like you just hang out.
Yeah, would you talk about that? I don't think people fully appreciate how responsible you are for your own time.
Yeah, it's a writing job. Right. And I had, you know, I had written my show, but I would kind of write it orally. I would work on it in my head and kind of write the beats and walk around the block, and then I'd do it in front of the audience and, okay, they like that joke, they like that, that didn't work. I kind of edited in my head and just perform it and learn it orally. So when I went to SNL, I was like, oh my God, there were a lot of people from the Groundlings, they'd be typing, and I was like, I have characters, but I just had to figure out how to get them on the page. And it was terrifying. I remember like, crying and feeling like the job was over my head. But I met this one writer, Steve Coren, who I'm still really close to, and he goes, well, tell me, what did you do in your show? Just tell me how. And I had a picture of Mary Catherine Gallagher, and I showed all the writers. I go, I did this character in my stage show. You know, do you think I could? And they go, well, what is it? And I go, well, she does this. They're like, I'd write a little out, and they go, yeah, the reason that's not going to work is because of this, and that's not going to work because of this and that. And I was like, it was so frustrating. Yeah. But then this one guy, Steve Coren, was like, sat down with me and he goes, tell me what you did in your show. And I go, okay, well, I come out and I go, hi, Mary Catherine Gallagher. Then I go like this, then I go like that, then I go like that, then I do that. And he basically we wrote it up together. Yeah. And it was the first sketch that I kind of got on, and it killed. It went great. Right. And I remember Gabriel Byrne was the host, and I don't know if they knew what it was going to be. I think maybe they didn't really believe in it, because basically, on Saturday, the dress rehearsal before the live show, they kind of order the show. They'll put at the top of the rehearsal what they think is going to be like the hits, and then the stuff that might not make it to air, they put at the bottom. And I remember my thing was, for the rehearsal on Saturday, was way at the bottom, where they didn't even have time to rehearse it. It was like, sorry, it's lunch, good luck, you know. And I was so mad, and it was way at the bottom of the show for dress rehearsal, and it made me so mad. I just felt like I don't think they know what this is going to be, like how physical it's going to be. So So basically, during the dress rehearsal, it went great. I just went crazy and knocked into the chairs and performed it, and Will Ferrell was in it. And then basically what happens is you do the dress rehearsal at 8 o'clock, and then you don't know what's going to get on air. You're kind of trying out your sketches. And then at 11 o'clock, you go into Lorne Michaels' office and you look on this board and see what sketches made it. And there will be a lot that will be cut, like 4 or 5. Right. So it's like seeing if you're casting a play. So you go in your costume from dress rehearsal. Like, say you did a cupcake sketch and you would go into Lauren's office in your cupcake, and you could see that you're like, oh, my cupcake sketch got cut. So you see people like in the costumes with like tears running down their eyes, you know. But basically, my Mary Catherine Gallagher got moved from the bottom to the top, and I was like, yes. Great. Yeah. And I went out there, and it went great, and then so many people responded to it, so that was really what gave me confidence. So like, I've got these characters, I just got to figure out how to get the characters to my show on air. Yeah. But like I said, you have to write yourself a spot to get on.
What was the first sketch that you wrote that got on air?
So my first show, the first sketch of the show I wrote.
That's like back to baseball. That's like somebody getting up at the plate for their first time in the majors.
I didn't know, right? I didn't know how, because then the next few shows I didn't have anything. Yeah. So I was like, oh yeah, this is more. But it was a sketch I wrote. The first host of musical guests were Steve Carell and Kanye West, which is pretty awesome.
Pretty good.
Pretty awesome booking. Yeah. Couldn't have lined that up better. So it was Steve Carell and Amy Poehler in the sketch, and it was the early days of JetBlue Airlines, and there was a mechanical problem on the plane. And people were watching television, and they were watching coverage of their own imminent plane crash.
Hilarious.
And luckily the plane landed safely and it was okay, so you could joke about it. But it was like this rare moment that people were actually watching, and so it was her watching and freaking out or her watching it freaking out, and him being oblivious and watching like a cartoon and being really happy.
Yeah.
And not really listening. And that was it. It was topical for that week.
Right.
And and it worked out and it got on. But
Perfect.
it was kind of a crazy shooting the moon for a show.
Yeah. Now, how do you go from being a writer to being the head writer, or you were co-head writer at one point?
Yeah, it's crazy when you start. You're so anxious,
Yeah.
because you don't know whether you're going to make it, and you don't know how it works. And then every year gets more and more anxious. You think it would
You think it's going to get better.
You think it would get easier. Like, oh my God, at least I know I have a job, and it gets more and more anxiety, because each year you have a little more responsibility. You usually get a few more sketches on.
Yep.
You might have a sketch every week, or maybe eventually 2 every week, or 3 every week. And that gets really stressful. And so, but it's a slow process of building up the responsibility and getting to that position. So I was a writer for a while and started having more success as a writer more regularly, and then got promoted to being a writing supervisor. And that's a stage sometimes people go through. And so, because Seth was still there.
Yep.
And Andrew Steele, who was the other writer when I started, who's great, was still there. And so I kind of worked up and got that position. And there are 2 writers now, Chris Kelly and Sarah Schneider, on our show who have that position,
Right.
who are going to move up at some point.
They're in the chute.
Yeah, who are
Right,
great
yeah.
writers in that. But it's a way you kind
Right.
of step out that, and you start going into meetings with Lauren and seeing how things are picked, which always seems, when you're on the other side, feels like the biggest mystery in the world. It's like
course.
seeing behind the curtain,
Yeah.
even within our show.
Yeah.
And who makes decisions and how that works. So you start getting glimpses of that, and occasionally he might say, Colin, what do you think about that sketch? And you'll be like, I didn't know I had to have an opinion. It's great, I love it. Oh God, I blew it. You don't know what to say.
Yep.
And then you get more comfortable in that space. And then I probably did that for 2 years or 3 years, and then became head writer with Seth.
I want to know what it took to get you from the Lampoon or from the paper on Staten Island to Saturday Night Live. Again, in the realm of stories of how people got to the show, there are people who tried and tried and tried year after year after year and finally got on. There are people like Mark Maron who tried and never got on and are still mad about it.
Of course.
You
yeah.
made a pretty quick path right there.
Yeah, and it's, obviously I was very lucky on a lot of levels that's the way it shook out.
Right.
I mean, when even when I applied for the Lampoon, it took me a year and a half to get in out of college, when I was in college. So that process was writing as much as you possibly could. People would look at it, give you notes, you'd submit. There were different kind of levels that you could get to. And I got really close twice and didn't get in. And the third time I got in. And so it was kind of similar when you apply to places as a writer. That's the mentality you have to have, is you just have to do it a lot.
More likely not to do it, or not to get it.
You're almost guaranteed to not get it.
Right.
So you have to, it's just a crapshoot. Even if you're really talented and really good, it's a crapshoot. It's a luck thing of if they have a spot open or they don't. But you have to go in with it into the process thinking, I have to be writing constantly.
Yep.
So that's what I did at the Lampoon, and that's what I did when I graduated. I applied everywhere I could. So I applied to Letterman, twice within that year. I applied to Conan. I applied to Daily Show. I wrote a spec script for Arrested Development at the time. I wrote a pilot about the fire department with a friend of mine.
Right.
And while I was doing the other jobs, because I knew that's what I wanted to do, and I didn't know where anyone would take me. And like when I was finishing Harvard, I submitted a packet to SNL also that I don't know if anyone even read or saw. And I'm sure it was terrible. But then I did it that year later and was lucky enough to get it.
There's been a history of Weekend Update as a sole practitioner deal.
Yes.
But then there's the partnership.
Yes.
And there have been great partnerships, Tina and Amy.
Yeah.
It was Jimmy and
Tina, and then Tina and Amy.
And then Tina and Amy.
And then Amy and Seth.
And then Amy and Seth. Yeah. So you and Michael Che get thrown together. And I remember Michael Che briefly as one of the reporters on The Daily Show.
Yeah.
And he was terrific and terrifically funny. I don't know that I would have imagined him in this role, but you seem to have almost instantly, despite what Twitter may say occasionally, you have a thing. The two of you really work well together as a team.
I mean, I love Michael, and I can't imagine. It's great working with him.
Did you know him before?
Yeah, I knew him as a stand-up. And I brought him in as a writer at SNL.
Oh, great.
Because but only just because he was clearly very funny. I mean, anyone would have hired him. It was not like, but he was, I just liked I liked his style. I liked his comedy a lot.
Yep.
Meeting him, you could tell he was just a humble guy, even though he is confident. And and I don't know, I just liked him. And then he was a great writer at our show. He still is a great writer at our show.
Right.
And then he basically, just in a summer, he did The Daily Show. When we stopped
it was just
writing,
a cup of coffee, right?
It was 2 or 3 months.
Yeah.
And then when that happened,
Right.
and the thing with he and I working together is he really pushes me, and pushed me from the beginning to make it our own.
Yep.
Which was something I think, because I had been in that system so long.
Yep.
And when I came in, I didn't push as much immediately to say, no, this is how I do things.
Right.
Because there was a whole system in place. All the
Yeah.
writers were still there,
Yep.
you know, from when Seth was doing
Do the two of you write the segment, yourselves, or others write?
We have writers who are great, who write for us, and we write stuff for it too. And sometimes, especially this year, we've been doing more where the two of us will go off and write some of the things that are more back and forth, and we'll talk through it the way we would in real life.
On Saturday Night Live, the characters are ones that you, as an individual, I think most people don't appreciate how the show works. You are largely responsible for your own fate there, right?
Well, yes, but you need the support of the other writers. It's
of
not like
course.
it's an island where you just sort of write something and it goes on the air. You kind of need the other writers to shape it a little bit, to put
Right.
some context to it.
But you develop the characters, and they help flesh them out and help write the sketches. But they don't
Yes.
come to you and say, you ought to do Queen Elizabeth as if she's a character in a Guy Ritchie movie.
Right,
Or
right.
They don't say, you should do Prince, or you should do the Californians.
True,
Yeah.
true. But sometimes they do come to you and they go like, can you do a crazy drag queen?
Right, just
You know?
generically.
Yeah, and then you kind of, you do sort of, there's a writer there, James Anderson, I'd say we come up with some stuff together. So it's a combination. Some stuff, I'll come into the office and I'll say, I've got this character, but there are times where someone will say like, can you do this kind of person? And then together you start forming that. So some of it does happen as accidents. There are some accidents that happen that have gone on to be their own character.
Do you occasionally get asked to do celebrity caricatures or to do other kinds of characters, and
Oh,
you
yeah.
think, I don't really want to do this, but okay, I'll take one for the show, and you have
I don't think in terms of I don't want to do it. I think like me, I don't think that's really me. I don't know if I have a take on it, and then it works out great. Like I remember David Lee Roth, one sketch, they were like, can you do David Lee Roth? I was like, I don't think so. And then I did it anyway, and it was a lot of fun.
Even though, right. Was Obama one where they came to you and said, we think you should do Obama when he was elected?
Lauren and Marcy Klein were like, they presented it more like, do you want to give it a try? And I was like, my answer is always yes. I'm like, yeah.
You're generally game for that sort of stuff.
It's a sketch show. It's a variety sketch show.
Right.
Why would I ever want to be like, no? You know,
Yeah.
it's like, I don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's give it a try.
And is the idea that you being associated with certain of these characters kind of over and over, people probably walk up to you in the street and say, do Prince or do...
Yeah, it's awesome.
You don't mind that? Because I imagine after a while it gets a little tiresome.
No.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about just a couple of the characters you've developed and ask you just to take us through your creative process. So I mentioned the Queen Elizabeth one. This is a personal favorite of mine, where the Queen seems all nice and very demure and everything, and then people leave the room and suddenly...
It's one of my favorites too, by the way.
It is an absolutely hilarious thing. And
thank you.
How did you? What was the thought process behind that?
Well, we wrote those with John Mulaney. He's another writer there, who's a brilliant comedian, and Bill a little bit too.
Bill Hader plays.
Bill Hader, plays Philip. And then the idea behind this, well, first of all, when I'm doing the sketch, I love it because it feels like I'm on a sketch show.
Yeah.
Like I feel like, wow, this is what it's like to be on a sketch show, you know, where it's like pure, it's just comedy. And for me, I just like doing an impression of Mick Jones from The Clash. That's all that is.
That's
you
who
know?
it's based on?
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
And then, you know,
right down to her playing the guitar. I mean, right?
Yeah. And then we wrote like a Clash-like song for it. But that was just like, it's an idea that's been done before, the sort of like behind closed doors kind
But
of
it's
thing.
happened. There was the old Saturday Night Live sketch of Phil Hartman as
They did
Ronald
Reagan. Same idea.
Same kind of deal where
Same
once
idea.
everyone's out of the room, he's a different person.
Yeah, which I love. It's such a great thing. And
Right.
then, you know, that was just something that we just love to do.
Right.
I love doing that sketch. It's so fun.
Now, of all the celebrity impressions, the straight, I don't think of that really as so much of a celebrity impression because it's so exaggerated.
never
but of all
know.
it's true. That's actually right. We've not
don't
been in the
know.
room. Maybe
Yeah.
she's that. Maybe she
Yeah.
is Mick Jones. Penny Marshall. The Penny Marshall impression just seems so great and over the
thanks.
top, and so on something like that, what's your thought process there?
Oh, I think that was bestowed on me as well. I think there were some writers, Marika Sawyer being one of them. They came up with a sketch idea called The Looker, because there were so many cable shows that were like, these detectives and stuff, that I had not had an impression, and they were like, would you mind can you try Penny Marshall? And then I just, she's kind of like, she doesn't, open her mouth when she talks, and then we just did it.
It's as much physical as anything, right?
Yeah.
It's the look.
So that I didn't think about it beforehand, and then it was easy to do.
The life of somebody in your situation, whether you're a cast member or a featured player, the stories we've heard on this show and we've heard people say elsewhere, it's a little bit like a hamster wheel. There's not really an off switch. You're constantly running all week.
Yeah, definitely.
That's true. That's your
That
experience.
is for me, at least. I am constantly, the show itself is always going when it's in production.
Right.
And I am constantly thinking about the show and what I'm going to write, what I'm going to do, and how I'm going to get better. And so I don't stop.
So take us through a typical week. What would a typical week look like?
Monday. Monday, we go in and we pitch to the host.
Right.
The pitches are very short. They're like kind of ideas. Then you kind of make appointments with writers. Then Tuesday, you come in and you write all night. I tend to leave around between 4 a.m. to 7 a.m. in the morning. Then come back Wednesday for a table read that takes place at 2 or 3. Then they pick the show after the table read. Everything goes into production. You rehearse Thursday, Friday. Friday, they shoot all the videos. And Saturday's the show.
And you have a fair amount of ideas, I'm sure. You were the kind of person who had enough ideas to make videos that went on the internet. You have ideas, and so you probably come in like everybody else and you're pitching away early in the week.
Yeah, everybody pulls their weight in a significant way. Like every cast member contributes, and almost as much as writers in however ways that they can.
Are the featured players considered less worthy of pitching ideas than the full-fledged cast members?
When the pitch meeting is actually everybody, Lauren goes around the room, and he'll just call your name out, and you say your 1 or 2 ideas very quickly, and then he just moves on. So it's kind of like a formality, but everybody gets a chance to say something.
So everything is equal at that,
everybody,
at that stage.
And if you say something that people like, then they'll be like, oh, we like that, you should write it, which is cool.
And you do a fair amount of writing on the show.
Yes.
You do. Writing for yourself as well as writing for others.
You have to write for the host, yourself, and as many people as you can include, especially with this cast being as big as
it's a very large cast.
It's a very large cast, and I think everybody's really cognizant of trying to get people involved. It's the hardest job in the industry. It's a miracle that there's a show any week. I think that everybody on the show is so talented, and I feel like people, I don't know, it's amazing. I have my respect for it is, I have a lot of respect.
And of course, the part that we see is probably only a portion of it. There's an enormous amount going on.
Oh yeah, you don't see. I mean, I think the biggest thing is when people come to the show, they're always like, "Oh, it's so much smaller." It's because it is. Like there'll be one portion of the studio where they'll put up 3 sketches because there's not space to put everything. So they'll just tear it apart and then put it back up. And the fact that it's such a well-oiled machine and that people have been working there for such a long time.
Right, and the fact that it's a live show.
And it's a live show. I mean, the odds are stacked against us in every way.
What about your brief stint on Saturday Night Live do you want to talk about? Was it a good thing?
It's brevity.
Was it a good thing or a bad thing? Well, there was people. Now the show is basically healthy again, or healthy-ish.
Much better, yeah.
But if you think about that period, it was not the healthiest period.
That was the period when Matt Roush would write a column every single Monday saying, "Please pull this show off."
Put this out of its misery.
It's New York Post at the time.
At the time, right?
I think he is
later
TV
guy.
Yeah, no, it was, and the show was a mess. They just didn't quite know what to do with it. And also,
you joined fairly. I mean, you were late mid-40s at the time.
Yeah, mid-40s.
Right. You may have been. I think the story is you were maybe the oldest cast member ever added in the history of the program.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I'm also one of 2 people who have been host, cast member, and musical guest.
And musical guest.
Dan Aykroyd and I.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, but it wasn't a bad experience necessarily. It's nothing that you look back on unhappily.
The best part about it, I've never been an infighter, really, and there was so much struggle going on to get pieces on. And, I was in 26 shows and I got 20 sketches on the air as a writer, mostly writing with Al Franken. I wrote a lot of stuff with him. And Dave Mandel, who's a wonderful writer, who's now does the Larry Sanders Show. Dave and I wrote some fun stuff together, and so I really had no complaints there. Occasionally, I would write a sketch, and Lorne would sum it up beautifully. Lorne Michaels, he would say, "This will never be anyone's favorite sketch, but it's important that we have it on." and it was usually something kind of a little highbrow. You
Wow.
know? Yeah, I know.
Right, damning with faint praise.
No,
times-
no. He was actually he liked the sketches, you know.
Yeah.
But
well,
they
in theory,
weren't.
he could have not had it on if he didn't want
Yeah,
it.
it wasn't like sketches that people despised, but they kept coming back.
Yeah.
You know, or sketches that were, you know, like Wayne's World. America could have watched that every week.
Every
you know?
week.
Yeah, because they was just really, you know, it hit them.
So that's just a line on your resume, but nothing too.
No. It was fine, and I got to know some cool people. You know, I worked with some really nice people there, and
Yeah.
I stayed friends with them, and it's a very interesting thing. What I'd like to say is that the time to do SNL is when you're 28 and hungry.
Mm-hmm.
I was 45, and I really didn't care. You know,
Yeah.
it was like, hey, really? We'll try this for a while, and then I get to. They're going to pay me. I'm living in my own hometown. You know, it'd be a cool thing, and then they'll say goodbye, and I'll go
Healthy
back
attitude
home.
to have.
You know what? There are so many opportunities for angst in this world. Skip some.
Yeah.
Skip every other one.
Yeah.
Because there are some that won't let you leave them alone.
We'd love to have you join us in the studio. Visit our website at klru.org/overheard to find invitations to interviews, Q&As with our audience and guests, and an archive of past episodes.
Funding for Overheard with Evan Smith is provided in part by Hilco Partners, a Texas government affairs consultancy, Claire and Carl Stewart, and by Laura and John Beckworth, Hobby Family Foundation.